They gave away all my clothes without asking, even the old quilted coat I gave birth in, the one with the loose button and blood-stained cuff. If you've ever lost something quietly, stay a while. We can share a cup of tea, and maybe a memory or two. Memories don't vanish all at once. They fray like fabric on the edge of wear, and sometimes you don't know something is gone until it returns in the arms of a stranger. I used to think silence was a gift, the kind that settles over you like morning mist, soft and cool, the calm after a storm, the breath before a lullaby. But this silence is something else. It hums through the walls of my house, not peaceful but empty, not sacred, but forgotten. This morning the kettle boiled and no one noticed. I poured the tea anyway, 1 cup, and placed it on the other side of the table, like I used to when he was alive, or when the children were still coming by. Out of habit, really. Or maybe defiance. Maybe grief is just routine, no one interrupts. The chair stayed empty, of course. Dust had gathered in its curves, and I let it. It made the absence more real somehow. I don't dust much these days, no one to care, and truth be told, there's a small comfort in the way dust settles, where people don't walk anymore. They say aging is a privilege. I've whispered that to myself. Brushing my thinning hair, buttoning up my house dress, looking in the mirror where my mother's face now lives. But sometimes it feels like a punishment too. A slow erasure. 1 wrinkle at a time. You don't notice when it starts, not when you're still making sandwiches for school lunches or remembering everyone's birthdays before Facebook did. Not when you're still ironing shirts, waiting for them to come home from work, or giving up your slice of pie because you're full, really. It happens quietly. You offer, you sacrifice, you say yes, even when you're tired. And they let you, because they believe you'll always be there. Until the day they stop asking, until you're no longer the first call, or the second, until you hear plans that were made without you. That happened last week. I heard about Lily's promotion from a neighbor. My own granddaughter, bright as spring tulips, moved to another state, and I found out standing beside a sack of potatoes at the grocer's. I didn't cry. I smiled, said, "Oh, how lovely for her." Like my voice was made of wallpaper and good manners. But that night, in the dark, I folded her baby clothes for no reason at all. They still smell like powder and thyme. It's strange how space expands when no one needs you. The house feels larger now. The stairs creak louder. Even the light feels colder. Blue instead of gold. I lit a candle tonight. Not for prayer, just for presence. To remind the walls I'm still here. I sat by the window and watched the wind flirt with the branches. And I wondered, when did my voice become a whisper in this home? When did I stop being central? Outside, someone walked past, young probably, laughing into a phone, their scarf trailing like a ribbon. I almost called out, just to prove I still could. But instead, I sat back in my chair. I wrapped the old shawl around my shoulders, and I listened to the kettle sing again. For no one. The wind rose, tugging at the edges of the window pane, and just for a moment I thought I smelled something familiar. Old cotton. Soap. A memory wrapped in fabric. My eyes drifted to the hallway, to the closet where the coat used to hang, where it used to wait for me, as if it still had somewhere to go. I stitched that coat myself. I was 19, still clumsy with a needle, still learning to hold things together. Cloth, family, even myself. The coat was made from scraps, an old flannel shirt of my father's, bits of my mother's faded tablecloth, a piece of curtain that once hung in my childhood bedroom. None of it matched, but it was warm, heavy, honest. I remember sitting by the window while I worked on it, my belly swollen, full with life and fear. The baby was due in December. Snow had already kissed the porch, and the wind was beginning to slice through the old farmhouse like it had something to prove. We couldn't afford a proper winter coat that year. So I made one. Not just for the cold, but for myself. Something to hold me while I held everything else. I wore that coat to the hospital the night he was born. My water broke too early. There was blood. I remember trembling in the back seat of that secondhand Buick, clutching my belly with one hand and the coat with the other. I'd sewn a button too loose. It popped off when the nurse helped me out of the car. It rolled under a bench and disappeared. I never replaced it. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I needed that reminder, and that not everything holds. The pain was long, quiet. I didn't scream. I never screamed. And when I held him in my arms, wrapped in that same coat, still damp, still trembling, I felt like I'd stitched him into my life with more care than I'd ever managed with thread. That coat carried more than fabric. It carried hours without sleep. Dinners skipped, lullabies hummed half awake. It soaked up spit up, formula, tears. It cradled fevered bodies and broken hearts. I wore it while I waited at bus stops, beside soccer fields, in grocery lines, through 3 funerals and 1 betrayal, and I kept it. Even when the elbows thinned, the color faded, and the cuffs frayed into tassels. I kept it folded at the back of the hall closet, not out of vanity. It was far too worn for that, but out of reverence. It had become a piece of me. Years passed, children grew, my body softened. The coat didn't fit anymore. But I never threw it away. So when I opened the closet last spring and found it missing, I thought I was mistaken. I checked again. Behind the old boots, the holiday wreaths, the dented suitcase. Nothing. I asked around, gently, cautiously. In the way older women learn to ask for things they no longer feel entitled to keep. "Oh," my daughter said, offhandedly. "We sent a few bags to the shelter. Thought we'd clear some space." I nodded, smiled, swallowed, cleared some space. It wasn't her fault. I should have labeled it, claimed it, guarded it like the relic it was. But you don't think you need to protect the parts of yourself that live quietly in a dark closet. You think the people you raised will know what not to touch. That night, I dreamt of holding him again, my firstborn, wrapped in that same old coat, cooing under yellow hospital light. When I woke, I pressed my hand to my chest and found it bare, cold. I stayed in bed longer than usual, eyes fixed on the ceiling like it might speak. I didn't tell anyone. Not really. There didn't seem to be a place for grief like that. Over cloth, over memory. But it sat heavy in my bones. Not loud, just persistent. Loss, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with trumpets and sobs. Sometimes it comes in garbage bags tied with red string. Sometimes it leaves in the back seat of a stranger's car, on its way to become someone else's treasure. I stopped opening the closet after that. Let the dust win. Let the silence settle. And yet, a week ago, while buying eggs at the corner market, I saw her. She stood in line ahead of me. Thin frame, crooked posture, her hair was tucked beneath a green knit cap, and she wore it. My coat. I knew it instantly. The pattern of mismatched patches, the sag at the left pocket, the missing button near the top, the one I never replaced. She turned slightly. I saw her face. Not young, not old. Tired, kind. She held a tin of beans and a loaf of day-old bread. Her gloves were fingerless. I didn't say anything. She didn't know who I was, of course. But I watched as she adjusted the coat around her, pulling it close like it still held warmth, still had a purpose. My throat tightened. Not from anger, not even sadness, but something else. Something quieter, like recognition. She walked out before I did. The bell above the door chimed once, a sharp, familiar sound. And for the first time in a long while, I walked home slowly. Not to hold on to the day, but to let it go. The wind followed me. It carried the scent of old cotton and cold air, and as I stepped into my front hallway, I realized something. Some pieces of us don't belong to us forever. Sometimes we give them away without meaning to, and they still find someone who needs them. And maybe that's a kind of grace. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind that slips by without asking your permission. gray light, stiff knees, coffee a little too bitter. I had just watered the violets by the windowsill when I heard the front door creak open. "Mom, you home?" my youngest called out, not waiting for an answer. She bustled in like wind through a paper screen, arms full of grocery bags and opinions. I watched her drop her purse on the side table, the one with the lace doily I'd crocheted when her sister was still a toddler. She didn't notice it shift under the weight. "Brought you a few things," she said, already in the kitchen. "And cleaned out your fridge a bit. You had a lot of expired stuff in there." I nodded, even though she wasn't looking. Then I saw it. The orange glass bowl, gone from the counter. My heart stopped for a moment, not in drama, but in defense, a reflex, like a scar remembering the wound. "That bowl," I started. "Oh, yeah," she interrupted, voice light. "It had a chip in it. You never use it anyway. I tossed it." Tossed it. I stood there, not moving, not blinking. My hands still smelled of potting soil. That bowl, I know it sounds silly, but it wasn't just glass. It was the last thing my mother gave me before she passed. A cheap thing, really. Carnival glass, a bit uneven in shape, the color of sunset and citrus. We used it every Christmas to hold the candied yams. I used it every birthday to toss fresh fruit, just like she used to. It was chipped, yes, but so am I. I didn't say a word. What would have been the point? She wouldn't have meant harm, just efficiency, just that impulse to take care of me, the way adult children often do, sweeping through like managers of someone else's museum. But I felt it. That invisible bruise, not just for the bowl, but for the way she moved through my house like it no longer belonged to me. It wasn't always like this. Once they used to ask before touching anything. Once they tiptoed into the kitchen, wide-eyed and asking where I kept the sugar. Once they called my name with reverence, not obligation. Now they call to check boxes. Now they clean what doesn't need cleaning, discard what looks old, what takes up space. And I let them. Maybe because I wanted to be easy to love, easy to help. Maybe because I feared the other side, being forgotten altogether. But that night, after she left, I sat in the kitchen with the light off. The refrigerator hummed, the faucet dripped, and the absence of that orange bowl was so loud, it pressed against my chest. Funny, isn't it? How the small things cut deepest, not betrayal with fireworks, but with a whisper. Not a slammed door, but a quiet rearrangement of your life, one misplaced item at a time. I could have spoken up. I could have said, that bowl mattered. But I didn't, because I knew how she would have responded. Kindly, rationally, maybe even with a touch of guilt. But the damage would be done. Instead, I held my silence like a teacup, cracked but still warm. That week I began to take note of other things that were no longer where they once lived. A framed photo of me at 23 had been tucked into a drawer. A floral apron disappeared from its hook. Even the little ceramic bird by the windowsill, gone, probably boxed up in the garage under the label seasonal. My house, my history, when was being edited in real time, for my comfort, for clarity, for space, but no one asked what space meant to me. Space to them is about clean lines and open counters. To me, it's where memory settles. It's where a bowl lives for 40 years and still smells faintly of cinnamon. It's where my mother's hands echo through glass. I know they mean well. I know it isn't malicious, but there's a certain kind of invisibility that comes from being loved incorrectly, the kind that turns you into a task, a responsibility, an old woman in a chair while others handle things. And it makes you small. That night, I retrieved the chipped plate I'd hidden in the back of the cabinet, the last of the old set from our first apartment. I served myself a little stew, ate slowly, let the sauce stain the cracks, let the silence keep me company. I lit a candle, not for ceremony, but for memory, and I whispered as I sipped my tea, "You don't throw away a life just because it's chipped." The wind outside rustled the curtains. The light flickered, and somewhere in the quiet of my own kitchen, I felt something return. Not the bowl, but my place at the table. It was a Sunday in late spring. The air smelled of cut grass and turned soil, the kind of day I used to bake on. Apricot cobbler, cinnamon rolls, pies no one asked for, but everyone ate. They'd invited me over. A family lunch, they said. Nothing fancy, just come. I hesitated, like I always do now. It's not fear, not quite. It's more like uncertainty, like stepping into a room where your name used to mean something. I wore the blouse Lily gave me last Christmas, pale blue with little pearl buttons. I remember her saying, "You need something modern." It didn't feel like me, but I wore it anyway. Sometimes wearing what they give you feels easier than keeping what you like. Their house was newer than mine. Open plan, wide windows, color-coded shelves, and curated plants. The walls were pale gray, the kind that looks expensive but never warm. There were no marks from crayons, no dents in the door frame from slammed tempers or tricycles, no history. I stepped inside, clutching a tin of butter cookies no one would eat. "Hi, Mom," she said with a quick hug. Warm but not rooted. There were voices in the kitchen, laughter, the clang of cutlery, music I didn't recognize. Children I'd tucked into bed now laughed at things I didn't understand. My son-in-law nodded from across the room. The little ones, my grandchildren, looked up briefly and went back to their games. No rush to greet me. No wide-eyed grandma like when they were smaller. The table was already set. 6 plates, polished cutlery, cloth napkins. No seat was marked for me, but I knew which one wasn't taken. I sat down quietly, smiled when spoken to, laughed in the right places, passed dishes, complimented the casserole, but somewhere between the salad and the dessert, I realized something. I wasn't part of this table. I was present, tolerated, even appreciated in some soft, obligatory way, but I was no longer woven into it. Conversations swirled around careers I wasn't updated on, vacations I hadn't heard about, inside jokes I wasn't inside of. "She always does that," Lily laughed, nudging her husband. I didn't know who she was. I didn't ask. At one point, the youngest tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, did you used to be a teacher?" I blinked. "No, sweetheart." "Oh," she tilted her head. "Then why do you talk like one?" The room laughed gently, not unkindly, but something in me curled. Because I was a teacher, just not in a classroom. I taught them how to tie their shoes, how to boil an egg, how to sit with grief. I taught them how to recognize hunger in someone's silence, how to read a room, how to say thank you when it hurts. But none of that counts now, does it? Because there was no paycheck, no certificate, no name on a plaque, just quiet knowledge, passed like soup from hand to hand, taken for granted. After dessert, store-bought lemon something, I offered to help clean up. "No, Mom, sit. You're our guest." Guest. The word echoed louder than it should have. Once, this daughter of mine used to fall asleep on my chest, breathing in rhythm with my heartbeat. She used to sit at my kitchen table, legs swinging, watching me knead bread with wide, adoring eyes. Now I was a guest. They cleared the dishes. I sat and watched. At one point, Lily opened a drawer and pulled out some dish towels. My dish towels. The red and white ones I embroidered back when we still lived in the old house. They'd come here when she moved, I suppose. Like many things I hadn't realized were gone. She used them to dry the glasses. Smiling. I almost said something. Instead, I traced the wood grain of the dining table with my finger and kept quiet. The sun dipped lower. The children vanished to their screens. The adults wandered into the living room. I stood in the hallway holding my purse. No one noticed. I opened the coat closet to hang up the sweater I'd brought. Inside were coats, puffy, bright, child-sized. And there, behind them, I saw it. The old quilted coat. My coat. Folded neatly on the bottom shelf as if it were just a spare blanket. Forgotten but not discarded. I reached for it, held it, breathed it in, still smelled of cedar, faintly, and something else. Maybe age, maybe memory. "Mom?" Lily appeared behind me. "Oh, that old thing, I was going to take it to Goodwill, but thought I'd ask first. I figured it might mean something." I nodded, smiled. "It did," I said gently. "It does." She tilted her head, uncertain. "You want to take it home?" I paused. My hand traced the edge of the sleeve, the fray, the threadbare softness. "No," I said, folding it back down. "It's not mine anymore." She looked confused, but she nodded. We said our goodbyes. I walked to the car alone. As I pulled away, I didn't feel angry, not even hurt. Just, clear. Some places, some people, some roles, they let you go quietly. Not with cruelty, but erosion. And when they do, you have a choice. Cling to the shoreline or begin to drift. The mirror in the hallway has hung there for nearly 40 years. It's narrow, oval, framed in cherry wood I once polished every spring. It used to reflect a woman in motion, apron tied, hair pinned back, lips pursed in thought. A woman always doing, always giving, always just slightly behind herself. Now, it reflects a woman in stillness. I passed it this morning on the way to the laundry room. I wasn't in a hurry. These days, there's no such thing as urgent. I stopped. Not intentionally. My eyes simply caught themselves, and for once, I didn't look away. The woman staring back at me had soft hollows under her eyes. Her shoulders stooped slightly as if they'd carried something for too long. Her hands, freckled, veined, strong, rested at her sides, palms open, like she was finally ready to receive something, or maybe to release it. I stared at her a long time, and I realized I didn't know her, not really, not the way I knew everyone else. My children, my husband, even my neighbors and their dogs. I could tell you their likes, their allergies, the foods that made them sad. I knew how my son stirred his coffee 3 times before sipping. I knew my husband's gait from 100 yards away. But I didn't know this woman. I didn't know what music she liked. I didn't know how she looked when no one needed anything from her. Because for most of my life, I had been everyone else's story. I was the background hum, the steady rhythm that made the melody possible but never claimed center stage. I was the glue, the spine, the hands that cleared the table, folded the socks, remembered the dates. When you do it long enough, you start to disappear from your own view. I don't say this bitterly. Love guided me, truly. But love, when left unchecked, can become something else. A leash you fasten around your own voice. I sat in the living room and pulled out an old photo album, the one with the worn leather corners and pages like dried leaves. I flipped through it, slowly. There I was, holding a baby, wiping cake from a cheek, clapping in the background of someone else's moment. Always present, but never paused for. No one ever took a photo of me just being, not reading a book, not staring out a window, not laughing too hard at something silly. Every image was attached to service, hosting, cooking, lifting, wiping, soothing. I started to wonder, what would I have looked like if no one had needed me? Who would I have become? Would I have painted again like I did in high school? Would I have learned to swim without fear? Would I have danced barefoot in the rain, not just watched others do it? There's a grief that comes with that question. The kind you don't name aloud because it feels selfish. A grief not of loss, but of never being, of pages unturned. I set the album aside, walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of tea. The house was still. Not lonely, not in that moment, just honest. I reached into the drawer beneath the sink, the one where I kept the unsorted things. There, among rubber bands and old receipts, was a small notebook. I'd bought it years ago, meant to write down recipes for the girls. I opened it. The pages were blank. For a second, I nearly put it back, but my hand moved. I wrote in tiny, deliberate script, "Today I remembered I exist outside of usefulness." Then I sat in that stillness and let the words sit with me. We are not born to serve endlessly, though we do it so well. We are not meant to be footnotes. We are not meant to vanish gently. The world rarely thanks women like me. We are the hands behind the curtain, the quiet engine under the floorboards. But today, I whispered thank you to myself for holding on, for staying soft in a world that constantly takes, for still being here. I looked in the mirror again later that evening. The light was warmer then, golden, curling around the corners of the hallway. This time, I smiled. Not because I saw beauty, not the kind magazine's name, but because I saw someone real, someone still unfolding, and somewhere deep inside me a small voice rose. Not loud, but certain. You are not gone. You are not finished. You are not just the coat. You are the one who made it. The mirror held that truth gently, and for the first time in a very long while, I believed it. It wasn't a dramatic departure. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no accusations hurled into the silence. I didn't write a letter. I didn't pack a suitcase with trembling hands. I simply stopped reaching where I was no longer met. Leaving, I found, is not always about distance. Sometimes it's about no longer contorting yourself to fit into a room you built, but were gently asked to step out of. It began with small things. I stopped offering first, stopped texting to check in on birthdays they already forgot I remembered, stopped baking the banana bread that always went untouched, except by guilt. I let silence arrive where noise used to live, and let it stay. They didn't notice, not at first. Busy people rarely do, and I no longer felt the urge to remind them. I canceled the magazine subscription for the grandkids that used to pile up unread on their coffee table. I left the group chat when they forgot to update me about Lily's engagement party. I didn't bring it up. I simply stayed home, watered my violets, and sat in the sun with an old book and warmer tea. At first, the quiet stung. It itched like a healing wound, reminding me with every slow breath that I was no longer part of their story in the way I used to be. But slowly, I came to see it as something else. Room. I had room again. Room to think, without worry tethered to each breath. Room to feel, not filtered through their needs. Room to remember myself not only as mother or wife or hostess, but as woman. One morning, I opened the hall closet and looked at the empty space where my coat used to hang. I thought of the stranger wearing it, walking down the road with her shoulders wrapped in my threadbare past. And I realized it was never really about the coat. It was about everything I poured into it. The sacrifices, the strength, the tenderness no one clapped for. And maybe it was time to give those things back to myself. So I began reclaiming my house. Not for show, not like they would, but gently, with care. I brought the orange bowl back from the thrift store. It cost me $1.50 in my pride, but I recognized the chip. It wasn't mine, not the original, but it was close. I placed it in the center of the kitchen table, empty, unapologetic, waiting for nothing. I took the photo of me at 23 out of the drawer and set it by the mirror. Not because I longed for youth, but because I wanted to remember I had once belonged to myself. I started eating dinner by candlelight. Again. Not for romance, but for ritual. Because light, even if only for one, should still be honored. And I walked. Not far. Just down the block, where the pavement cracks and the neighbor's cat follows you halfway like a chaperone. I noticed how the light dappled through trees, how my knees ached less when I smiled, how air feels different when it isn't rushing. Sometimes I'd pass the grocery where I saw the woman in my coat. I looked for her. Not out of longing, but out of quiet kinship. We never met again. But she remained in my thoughts, the way she pulled that coat tighter around her, not knowing its history, but sensing its warmth. That, I realized, is how memory survives, not by being preserved exactly, but by being used. There was a moment, a few weeks later, when my daughter called. Just to check in. I could hear chaos behind her voice, children arguing, a pot boiling over, a TV too loud. She asked if I could come by. I said gently, Not today, sweetheart. I'm resting. A pause, then a quiet, unfamiliar response. Oh, okay. She didn't push, and I didn't explain. I hung up the phone, set it aside, and made myself tea. Loose leaf, the kind that blooms in the cup. I took it to the porch and watched the sky change colors like it had nowhere else to be. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I was missing something. Because there is a peace that comes, not from being needed, but from no longer needing to be. Some would say I withdrew. I didn't. I returned. To myself, to a woman who can sit in a room and not measure her worth by how full it is, to a woman who can be alone and not be empty. The exit was not loud, it was barely noticed, but for me, it was everything. The hardest part about starting again at this age is not the solitude. It's the quiet negotiation with yourself. What do I keep? What do I release? What parts of me were built for others, and which belong to me now that I'm finally listening? I didn't reinvent my life. That's a word for younger women. I simply rearranged it. I moved slowly, like someone learning a new language in their native home. Each gesture became deliberate. Each day, a blank page I no longer feared. I began with the garden. It had long been more a patch of stubborn weeds than anything alive. For years, I trimmed it for the neighbor's sake. Never mine. But now I dug my fingers into the soil not to please anyone, not to keep up appearances, but to feel the earth under my nails, to remind myself that I still had the strength to grow things. I planted lavender along the fence. It wasn't practical, it's an unknown. It doesn't feed you, it doesn't climb, it doesn't bloom big, but it calms the air. It makes the wind smell like memory. And that felt like enough. Inside, I changed little things. I moved the armchair closer to the window where the morning light pools. I replaced the old blinds with soft linen curtains that flutter, even when the air is still. Like the house is breathing again. I went to the market every Wednesday, not out of need, but rhythm. The girl at the flower stall began to recognize me. One morning, she handed me a small bouquet. Forget-me-nots. For free, she whispered. I pressed them between the pages of a book later that night, let them flatten into time. I made soup again, just for myself, the kind I used to make for others, always with too much salt or not enough praise. But this time, I ate it slowly, from a ceramic bowl I glazed myself in a class I took at the library. There, among other women, some younger, some older, some silent, I found a quiet kind of community. No one asked where I'd been. No one cared who I once was. We spoke through clay and hands. It was enough. And the dreams, strangely, softened. For a long while, I used to wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, chest tight, from memories that never fully happened. I would dream of birthdays I wasn't invited to, of tables set without a chair for me, of a daughter's voice saying, "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to come." But now, the dreams are simpler. Last night, I dreamt of walking through a field. Alone, yes, but not lost. I was wearing something loose, something blue, and I wasn't carrying anything. My hands were free. When I woke, I didn't cry. I opened the window, let the morning in. Sometimes the phone rings. Sometimes it doesn't. They still forget things, holidays, calls, the way I take my tea. But I no longer measure their love in how well they remember me, because I've remembered myself. I began writing. Nothing grand, little vignettes, half recipes, notes to a girl I once was. I don't know who will read them, maybe no one. But the act of writing is a kind of return, like winding a clock that had sat still too long. The other day I wrote this. She no longer made lists for others. She made plans for the weather, for the mood, for the way the sky looked like a watercolor left out in the rain. It made me smile. It didn't sound like the woman I was, but perhaps the woman I'm becoming. I have not hardened. That's something I feared, that all this shedding would leave me bitter, brittle. But no, I am softer if anything, but firmer too, like bread left to rise longer than the recipe called for, not ruined, just different. There are still pangs, of course. A song will play, a scent will pass, and I will remember, not with longing, but with an ache that asks for no resolution. Grief, I've learned, doesn't ask to be healed, only acknowledged. And joy, when it returns, does so quietly, like a bird landing on the windowsill. You don't move, you don't speak, you just let it stay as long as it wants. I sat outside yesterday evening with a cup of mint tea. No occasion, just the golden hour folding itself across the garden, the lavender humming with bees, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like a background character in my own story. I felt like a woman, living, not for anyone, but for the sheer, simple, holy reason of still being here. I was almost dusk when the envelope arrived. Plain, off-white, my name in uneven blue ink, slightly slanted like someone not used to handwriting anymore. No return address, just a soft fold and the faint scent of jasmine, or maybe old paper. I turned it over once, twice. For a long time, I didn't open it. I set it beside the teacup, finished my drink, and listened to the clock tick its way toward evening. Letters don't often come to this house anymore. Bills, catalogs, reminders, yes. But a letter? A real one? That's a rare and tender thing. Eventually, I slit the top with a butter knife, careful not to tear. Inside was a single page, folded twice. No greeting, no formalities. Just this. I wore your coat today. It was cold out, and I hadn't planned well. I almost didn't go to the shelter at all. But something about it, the weight of it, felt like safety. There's something in the lining, not a note, not an object, just something warm I thought you should know. Whoever you are, you stitched kindness into that coat. It held me when I was shaking. It helped me walk home instead of giving up. Thank you. That coat saved me more than once. I hope you're well. I hope someone holds you the way your coat held me. There was no signature, just a closing line in smaller handwriting. I washed it gently. I patched the cuff. I'll keep it safe. I sat very still. The paper trembled in my hands. Not from fear, not from sorrow, but from something gentler, like being seen in reverse. Echoed. I placed the letter on the table and stared at it for a long time. So much of my life had been poured into that coat, thread by thread, night by night. I had wrapped it around my newborn child. I had worn it while waiting for news in hospital corridors. I had pulled it tight when the world felt sharp and cold and disinterested. And now it lived a new life, not in a closet, not in a landfill, but on the back of someone who needed what I once needed, shelter, even if only made of fabric and love. It was strange how that simple letter reached deeper than any apology, any belated invitation, any holiday call, because it recognized me, not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden, but as someone who gave and whose giving mattered. That night, I didn't light a candle. I didn't write a reply I couldn't send. Instead, I opened the window wide and let the air in. The scent of lavender drifted up from the garden. Crickets began their songs. I felt no need to fill the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. Later, as the moon rose, I reached into my drawer and pulled out the notebook again. I wrote, "Love doesn't disappear. It moves. It travels in coats and letters, and the weight of kindness passed hand to hand." Then I turned off the light and let the quiet fold itself around me like an old friend. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Lily arrived, unannounced, holding a pie, apple, slightly burnt at the edges. She looked tired, but in that way mothers always do, like they're holding too much and still offering more. She didn't rush in. She stood at the door, eyes scanning the porch, the flowers, the wind chime I'd finally rehung. "I was thinking of you," she said. I nodded, stepping aside. We sat in the kitchen, not saying much, just tea, a little pie. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug like she was winding herself up to speak. Then, quietly, "I read something the other day about how women vanish after a certain age. Not because they're gone, but because no one looks. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. I think I stopped looking for you, Mom. You were always just there. Always handling things. I think I forgot you were more than that. I didn't respond right away. I just reached out, placed my hand over hers. You didn't forget, I said softly. You were just busy becoming. She nodded, eyes wet. Do you ever miss it? She asked. Being needed? I smiled, slow and deep. Sometimes, but I don't need to be needed anymore. I just want to be known, even a little. She looked down. I'd like to try. To know you, I mean. There was nothing grand in that moment. No sweeping music, no sudden epiphany. Just a daughter looking at her mother like a woman, and a mother forgiving what was never spoken, only felt. Before she left, she noticed the letter pinned to the fridge, held there with a crooked magnet shaped like a strawberry. Who's that from? She asked. I just smiled. Someone who wore my coat. She didn't understand, not fully. But that was all right. She hugged me at the door, a little longer than usual. And when she walked back to her car, she turned around halfway, like she remembered something. Lavender looks good on you, Mom. I stood on the porch, the letter fluttering gently in the breeze behind me, and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Not for the coat, not even for the letter, but for the knowing, for the letting go, and for the grace of finding myself again, thread by thread, in the spaces I thought were lost forever.